Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Sharby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. We did a couple of live streams that you guys can check out. The VOD is up on our channel under the live section, so if you really do want to watch that, please go and do that. And in today's episode, we have some series openers, and some game twos to discuss, along with some coach firings as well. Before we do get started with today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
So, so let's kick it off. So obviously the second round has begun, and we had a number of games since the last time we did an episode, right?
Yeah.
So, obviously we already talked about Minnesota Denver game 1 and game 2, right? Because I'm pretty sure both of those games happened, since. But we had some other series that kicked off, right? We had Knicks Pacers, we had Mavs OKC, we had Cavs Celtics, right? So start with Knicks Pacers. So the Knicks won both of the first two games, right? The first game they won 121-117. Second game they won 130-121. Both of those games kind of had a similar script where, there were stretches where like the Pacers, obviously they sped the game up. They forced the Knicks to play faster. And the Knicks obliged, which allowed, the Pacers to kind of continuously score. It was, it was not a very good defensive game from either team in game 1. But the Knicks made all the big plays down the stretch of the fourth quarter. Obviously, game 1, right, had, a series of, controversial calls, right, that a lot of people felt impacted the game in the last 5 minutes, right, including, things like the kick ball, right, violation where they couldn't go back to review the kick ball or challenge it or whatever, right? And then you also had the other play with the Miles Turner offensive foul, right? And we went through that in the live, right, where it was like, it was an offensive foul in the last 2-minute report, they concluded that it was an offensive foul. But we know, obviously, as we talked about, it's a lose-lose situation. A lot of people would generally say, don't call this at the end of the game because you don't want, the last thing you want is for the game to be kind of decided by the referees. But then you also have to look at it from the other perspective where, you know, let's say they scored and then in the last 2 minutes it should have been an offensive foul and that could have been, one of the deciding possessions of the game, then the other side is going to complain and be like, "How did you not call that?" So it's tough. Um, but again, overall, over the course of a game, over the course of a series, like things kind of even out, right? Like I know that obviously the Pacers, even in game 2, right, they were not happy with certain stretches. Game 2, I think they just got beat. Where it's like I just don't think you can really complain about the officiating too much in the second game. Brunson was hurt, for a stretch in the second quarter where he wasn't even out there, and the Pacers built up a double-digit lead. They were able to hang in there because they got, other contributions from other guys offensively like OG Anunoby, Josh Hart, right, which has kind of been the story over the first couple of games. DiVincenzo's been great in this series so far, right, bouncing back after some, rough early games in the Sixers series, um, which is keeping the Knicks in it. But obviously, now after game 2, got some tough news, right, for the Knicks because obviously Brunson, he's questionable for game 3 with foot. I assume he's going to play, unless he's obviously listed as out. But obviously now he's dealing with an injury, right? And this is where you kind of see some of the attrition building up now for the Knicks. And OG Anunoby, right, gets hurt. I think it was late in the third quarter, right?
Yeah.
Where he, and it was kind of like the Zion play, right, where it wasn't like a super, you know, contact play where like somebody just like knocks into him. You could tell it was a hamstring injury right away. He came out and he was listed as out for the rest of the game very quickly. And now Shams and Woj have reported that he's already out for game 3 and is probably going to be out for game 4, right? Which obviously kind of makes it tough for the Knicks now because now you're basically down to like 5 guys. They've played Precious Achua more because we already know Mitchell Robinson's out. But it's tough, right? Because there was a stretch where Siakam kind of was able to get going a little bit more because there was no OG out there. But, the Knicks still made all the big plays in the fourth quarter, right? Hartenstein almost had a triple-double, right? DiVincenzo had some big shots. And Brunson was great, to be able to close it out. But now it's tough because now you're probably going to be without OG for at least, game 3 probably game 4, maybe more, depending on how serious the injury is. But the first 2 wins do buy you some time. But the Pacers are going to have to at least do a better job on defense. Halliburton was much better in game 2, so that's part of it as well. But it's rough, right? Because you can see TJ McConnell when he's out there. He's played very well. The Pacers are clearly better when he's out there. But Carlisle didn't go back to him, right? He closed with Nemhart, who still had some big shots. But, also McConnell's out there for his pesky defense. So, it's kind of a catch-22, I guess. But, we'll see what happens in game 3 and 4 in Indiana. You expect the Pacers to be better, especially because now OG Anunoby's out. So that's just another guy that you're just not going to be able to have on either end of the floor. But like I said, the first 2 wins do buy the Knicks some time. So if OG can come back and he's okay, they should probably still be able to close out the series. But we don't know because we don't know how serious it is. But he's already out for at least a couple of games. Probably not great. So
Yeah, and the way that I kind of look at this series is more so like, it's gonna come down to the X factors for sure. Because I think even if Brunson, didn't get hurt, they probably still would have won this game by a similar margin, just due to the fact that I think he would have, put up more points than that because he was only like 11 away from another 40-point game. So even him being hurt, he was still very, very good when he came back, which is I think the more surprising thing. And then Josh Hart showing up, like you were talking about, DiVincenzo showing up, and I'm really like tempted to call these 2 guys stars because that's really how they've played in this series thus far. And then just the OG thing really, really does hurt because, like you're talking about, now you're down to 5 guys. What do? You don't have Mitchell Robinson. You don't have Bogdanovich. Now you don't have OG Anunoby for who knows how long. And that's really going to be tough because the one weapon that the Pacers probably do have against you is depth. And now you don't have anything to really rotate towards. I mean, I doubt they're going to, rotate in a Jericho Sims. I don't see that happening. I don't see them really giving Burks a lot of time. He played in 1 minute in game 2, played in 1 minute in game 2. But I don't really foresee him getting a lot of minutes. So, I think they're going to stick with Deuce McBride, but, he has to be a positive out there because he was a very bad negative in this game. Didn't really do all that much. And then Achua also kind of similar thing where, I think we talked in the live stream and I said, Mitchell Robinson may not be as big of a factor, but, I guess that was more so me kind of looking at the box score because in this game you could tell, when Hartenstein wasn't out there or, they did put Achua in for OG Anunoby, you could tell, like, Siakam kind of had his way and was getting, the easy buckets. And you never really want that. You never want a star to get easy buckets, especially in the playoffs. So I do understand what Mitchell Robinson's factor brings to, this Knicks team. And you can definitely tell it hurts not having those guys out there. Josh Hart playing another game where he did not sub out once. It's going to be crazy. I don't know how they do this, but I think, they probably beat Indiana in this series. I don't think that's really that much of a question. It's just whoever they end up facing in the next round, which will probably be Boston, I don't foresee them really winning that. I just don't see it because of how much output and energy they're putting into this one series, and they're going to be probably down to like 5 or 6 guys like you were talking about. But all in all, if you're Indiana, I think you need more all around because as like you were talking about, Halliburton had a great game, and it's just the other guys. I think you just need a little bit more. And Miles Turner, he had a rough game. I think the bench.
I think Siakam hasn't been great in this series either.
Yeah, they've definitely exploited him, kind of limited him as well. But like you were talking about, even the coaching, it's bad. Like Indiana's coaching is a little wishy-washy, I think. Having a guy like McConnell out there, you could tell he was the only person, I think they said this like 10 times in the broadcast, the only person giving Brunson any trouble on defense. And yeah, to not play him in those final minutes hurts because I think, you could have hoped and gotten maybe a couple of stops. And I know they submitted 78 complaints? Yeah, 78 complaints about calls that didn't go your way.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you got outballed by a team that is limping on one leg at this point. And you need to worry about adjustments instead of, foul calls and stuff like that. But I get what they're trying to do. They're trying to set the precedent. This isn't the first time we've seen this. They're trying to say, we need some calls going our way going into game 3, because game 3 is a must win for Indiana, regardless of how you see it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if they lose game 3, then they're down 3-0. Probably no bouncing back from that. You can't
Right.
lose you can't lose any of the Indiana games pretty much. I mean, because the Knicks have already won 2 in New York, right? So it's only so you got at most 5 games left, right? So that means you're gonna have to probably steal one in New York, and then win all your Indiana games. You just can't, right? So
Yeah, bro.
I'm assuming we'll see a more locked in, souped up Pacers, especially because again, Anunoby's going to be out. So I just feel like they're probably going to be better. But again, the question is, can they find ways to still slow down the Knicks? Because again, the offense for the Pacers hasn't really been as much of an issue, even though again, like there are some guys that probably should be playing better, like the defense. Like I mean, like the game was pretty much over, like, with a few minutes to go. Like, they were down by 10. And I mean, even without Anunoby, like, it was just like they were still giving up offensive boards. They were still allowing a lot of easy drives. They were still giving up a lot of threes.
Yep.
So that's going to happen. But again, they're not a great defensive team. So, um, we already know this at this point. So, they're just going to have to play their game, play their way. And I think you're just going to have to hope for some better offensive performances and just hope that you can just kind of blow the Knicks offensively out of the water. I think that's kind of what you're going to have to hope. I just feel like if you're in a close game with the Knicks, you're probably going to lose because it just seems like the Knicks, every game for them is a close game. So they're pretty familiar and pretty comfortable with those environments. And,
Yeah.
again,
They know how to
Brunson,
close.
yeah, then you've got Brunson, who's again continued to be the best player in this series. So that's gonna have to change, right? Like, I mean, if the Pacers want to flip it, like you said, either you need even more performances from your bench, or some of their stars or starters are they're gonna have to be better because
Yeah.
the Knicks starters have outplayed the Pacers starters by a pretty significant margin. Even though the Pacers bench has been better than the Knicks bench, obviously, because the Knicks don't have it. So the starters are gonna have to win the Indiana games, I think.
Yeah.
So I mean, again, and that's the rough part with the Knicks is again you're down so many players that I just don't really know how many more contributions you can get. But we'll see because they've been able to continue to pull some some things out from there. But yeah, it's I just if they get out of this series alive, I just feel like it's going to be very difficult to move on. Like, but even so, like it's still an incredibly impressive run, no matter how you slice it, just
Yeah.
because of the fact that they've been able to do this, because I think most people kind of pegged them when Randall got hurt as being, in a rough spot. Like Anunoby, was playing and they were playing well, and then he went down, and then they were like, okay, well, once both guys went down and they were losing games, they were probably cooked. Then Anunoby comes back, then he has a setback, and then comes back again. So that's the tough part is that it's just been a lot of rough injuries for them. But I think regardless of what happens, you still look at it as a successful season. And obviously,
100%.
we'll get there when we get there, because we'll talk about teams when they get eliminated, and then in the offseason, we also, do our grading scales and whatnot. But, obviously, we're talking about the series right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, Pacers have. I mean, this is not rocket science. This is not a hot take. The Pacers have to win Game 3.
Yeah.
Um,
Who
do
do you
you think
think's
they
going to
will?
win the series though? Like how do you feel about it? Cuz I'm still confident in New York. I think Brunson is going to light them up as he normally is if he's healthy. The problem is we don't know. Like you said, he's questionable. But if OG Anunoby's not playing, I mean, come on. Like who else can you really sub in here? Like
Right.
I think Jalen Brunson's playing, even if he's not 100%. But I'm taking the
Yeah,
Knicks on this one.
I think I'm still gonna lean towards the Knicks,
Okay.
but it's more so like a slight lean now because I could just see a scenario where like the Knicks maybe just don't have enough offense, towards the end of the game, and like Indiana just gets hot because we know it's because, but again, like it's not like the Pacers' offense has been terrible. I mean, I guess in game 1, right, you could say, I mean, they had 117 right in game 1,
Yeah.
and then what did they have in game 2? 121. I mean,
Yep.
how much better offensively can it really get? You know what I mean? Like, I guess like all their guys could play well, and they could drop like 130 or 40. But I mean, that just doesn't normally happen in a playoff environment. But we'll see. Because I think the main issue for the Pacers really has been a combination of defense, and then you just need a little bit more from some guys. But again, like we'll see. Because again,
Yeah.
like the Knicks scoring 130 probably should normally happen. Because again, like you're scoring 140 with or 130 or whatever with literally 5 players. I mean, come
Yeah.
on.
And it's like, you're giving up easy stuff to Anunoby, Brunson, Hart. DiVincenzo. All those guys, they balled out. And, I don't
Right,
think you can have that. You can't have that. That just
yeah,
shows
because
you how
that was
bad they are on defense.
right, because that was probably Anunoby's best scoring game, and that was basically through that was in 28 minutes. I mean, like, if he had stayed in the game, he probably would have had 30 plus.
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
Um,
for sure.
I mean, like, obviously, like, it would have ran through, and like a lot of that was during the stretch where Brunson was out, so maybe he just doesn't get as many touches. But you kind of assume he probably at least makes a few shots. I mean, that can't happen. And then
Hmm.
obviously Josh Hart having 15 rebounds. I mean, literally out rebounding like all the Pacer starters. Like that's just it's not ideal. It's not an ideal position for himself.
Right.
Um, but moving on, yeah, and then actually, yeah, because I see Aaron Neesmith had 1 rebound. Andrew Nemhart had 0.
Yep.
So yeah, that's not great. But either way, um, yeah. So the next series, right? Obviously, Cavs, Celtics, right? That series has been kind of funny, right? Because I know, like, we still obviously believe that the Celtics are going to win
Yeah.
this series, but obviously we already talked about, well, I guess we haven't talked about it, right? But game one, we kind of expected it, right?
Yeah.
Celtics just smacked Cleveland. It was close, I think, for maybe like a quarter and a half, maybe, but then like after that, it wasn't. I mean, Boston hit every shot. Derek White has basically turned into Stephen Curry. I think prior to game two, he was shooting like 50% from three on 9 attempts, like over 9 attempts a game. I mean, there's nothing you can do about that. I mean, Tatum wasn't even that great, but Jalen Brown was awesome. And we talked about the problems for Cleveland where it's like, you know, even though they have, some of the front court guys like Mobley, I guess, you know, you have a small backcourt and you don't really have a lot in terms of like bigger wings. So then guys like Tatum and Brown can kind of just easily score, shoot over guys, or even like a Derek White, right? Like his guard, like the guards they are guarding him, right? He can shoot over them as well.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of a problem, obviously. But then in game two, right, you saw it flip, right? And this is pretty much like if you're the Cavs and you want a chance to win, this is how you would have to win, right? Because you'd have to outshoot them from three, play pretty good defense and kind of, limit the Celtics threes, right? Because I think they took 35, right? Which
Yeah.
is, like a decent amount, right? But this time around, they only made 8, right? So obviously they shot horribly. And then Cleveland shot the lights off the basketball.
Yeah.
And then you had a really, really good game from Mobley because he was pretty bad, I think, in game one, like until there was like a stretch where like the game was out of reach and you could see him starting to score and you just shook your head because you're just like, why didn't you do that in the beginning of game one? Um, but in game two, right, he pretty much led the offense, right, during the first half for the most part, right? He had, 21, 10, 5 assists, 2 blocks, a steal. I think a good chunk of those points were like in the first quarter. Um, and then, from there, right, then you got everyone else, right, contributing, right? Because like Max Strus got a few buckets. Garland was better this game. Mitchell was still pretty good, and he was able to kind of chill on offense during the early part of the game because Mobley got it going. And even Okoro had some pretty good stretches. There was like this weirdo, what are you doing from a coaching perspective stretch where like Mobley played the whole first, which is fine. But to begin the second quarter, George's Niang started at center. And then the Celtics just immediately came back into the game. I
Yeah.
don't even know what the point of that was at all.
Yeah.
And he went with Tristan Thompson after that. So yeah. And he got some rebounds and I think he got a block, but I just don't know what the point of that was at all.
Yeah.
Because if they had lost that game, right? Because again, this was a tie game at halftime. The Cavs ended up winning by 24. I think they were up by as much as 29.
Yeah.
Um, but it was a tie game at halftime. It wasn't like, the Heat Celtics game where, it was kind of close for even like in the fourth quarter. And then the Heat ended up winning by, 10 or whatever. Like this game was close in the first half. And then even in the fourth quarter, like it wasn't out of reach, right? I think the Cavs started the fourth up maybe like 12, 14 or so. And then the Celtics just kind of just gave up, which again, I don't really like the idea of giving up or giving away playoff games. Like, because that was a winnable game after the third. Like, you knew the Cavs were shooting well and that it looked like they might win. But I don't know. Because, like, we saw with the Nuggets, right? Where they, in that game four against the Lakers, right? The Lakers obviously took it to them. But the Nuggets just kind of just backed down. And then obviously we see what's happened with them where, like, Jamal Murray gets hurt in that game. You end up playing an extra game that goes down to the wire. And now you're in this series against Minnesota, right? And Jamal Murray's not himself. And now everybody looks kind of gassed and tired, right? So you just can't do that if you're Boston, right? Because that's kind of what happened in the first round, right? They had to play an extra game, and obviously the Heat shot the lights out of the ball, but that was still a close game that they could have won. Actually, even closer than this game, right? Then Porzingis gets hurt in one of those games. He's not available, right? I mean, we assume he comes back at some point, but not in this round. And you need him if you want to be able to win it all. So,
Yeah.
I mean, just a bad game from Boston. Like they'll be fine, but again, it was just I don't know. It just is kind of if you're the Celtics, you don't like having games like this. But again, we do know with or without Porzingis, they're pretty reliant on the three, and if they don't shoot it well, not that they can't win, but it becomes significantly harder. Um, because that's just how it goes, right? I mean, like just in general, we've seen this team, for a while now. We know when they're playing well, and Derek White, he was also pretty awful, and it feels like when he doesn't play well, I mean, like it hurts the offense a little bit. I mean, both guards were bad. I mean, like because Holiday was pretty awful. I think he was worse than White.
Yeah.
He just doesn't take as many shots, but it's just something to look at because again, you figured at a certain point the shooting would just stop for Derek White at a certain point because there was no way he was going to shoot 50 from three on 9 attempts a game. That's just unsustainable. But you would have hoped that okay, he doesn't have it, but maybe somebody else does, and no one else really did. Like Tatum had 25, but he was I don't know, he was not great in this game. And then
Yeah.
Brown was bad. Like
Yeah.
nobody for the Celtics really honestly played that well, other than I guess Peyton Pritchard. But obviously, if he's your quote unquote best performer, yeah, you're probably not winning that game.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't want to discredit everything the Cavs did this game because it was
Yeah,
amazing.
they played very well, and I liked a lot of the stuff that they did with Mobley, where he stopped settling and he was attacking in the pick and roll and just playing a lot stronger around the basket because that's what he has to do.
Exactly. And it's like, this is ideal for Cleveland, but at the end of the day, I think they really just got lucky. Like just being blunt and being real. Boston kind of finally cooled off, like you were talking about. Derek White kind of cooled off, and then Tatum. I think if this might be a hot take, but I don't think Tatum's played his best basketball at all during this entire playoff run thus far. He needs to be better if they want to, win the finals this year. So I didn't see a lot that I liked from Jason Tatum at all. And like you were talking about, overall, the guard play was just horrendous. Jaylen Brown, everything, nobody was making anything from three. And then also, the thing that helped Cleveland was Karis LeVert, their scorer, actually showed up to score, which is exactly what he's supposed to do because he doesn't play a lick of defense. So, like I said, everything happened ideally, I think, for Cleveland in this situation, which is beautiful because you got one of your guards playmaking between Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell. This time it was Donovan Mitchell. And he was also sparking threes at a very efficient rate and some very contested ones and fling shots, which I was very surprised. I was like, okay, the basketball gods are on these guys' side for this game. They had the hot hand clearly. And, Boston, I think if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they dropped game 2 against Miami, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
me too.
Yeah,
Both
so
both games that they lost were at home, and they lost both basically by double digits.
yeah, so the series being even, that's cool, that's fine and dandy. But at the end of the day, I don't think I'm worried. I think Boston's gonna probably wipe the floor with Cleveland at home. Barring a crazy Donovan Mitchell game or Karis LeVert actually shows up again. But regardless, I think you do feel very good about this if you're Cleveland, because like you were talking about, Evan
Yeah,
Mobley showing up, and normally when you look at this team, you kind of think, okay, it's the Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland show, but in reality, it should be one of those guards in the Evan Mobley show at this point, because Evan
yeah,
Mobley has all the space he needs and could want, without Jared Allen out there.
right.
And he needs to take advantage of that because he's been piss poor on offense this entire series, or not entire series, but most of the postseason.
Yeah,
And he finally showed up, and it's good to see. You look at it, plus 35. He pretty much contributed to the win alongside Donovan Mitchell. That duo was very fun to watch, I think, in this game, and they need to kind of capitalize on that and maybe grow from it. I think kind of just keep on adding on to that because I think there's something special that could potentially bloom there. It's just a matter of, I don't think it's gonna happen this postseason. I think it could potentially happen later on in Evan Mobley's career where he really does figure out the offense. But if we're sticking with this series, I'm not worried about Cleveland, or I'm not worried about Boston, excuse me. I just think this was a bad shooting night from them, like you were talking about. Live by the three, die by the three. That's pretty much what happened here. Even the bench guys, they didn't really show up. Peyton Pritchard tried, but at the end of the day, I mean, you can't really compete.
Yeah, I mean, again, like with Mobley, like you said, without Allen, this is kind of where like he needs to, like you said, dominate, especially also without Porzingis on the other end, because
Yeah,
then there's not
facts.
really a guy, that's tall enough to really bother him. Because obviously, like Horford is physical, but he's like what 6'9" or whatever, and Evan Mobley is basically 7 feet. Now,
Hmm.
again, you would feel like Horford has the strength advantage, but outside of him, there's nobody really big enough, or long enough to really bother or contest Mobley. So this should be like a stretch without Allen where he should play pretty well. I'm curious whenever Allen comes back, what does it look like? Because obviously we know like Allen in the games he was healthy played pretty well. But
Very.
it's so hard for both of them to play together. I mean, you really just look at this series. I feel like you know I don't really think like if they losing in this series, I feel like basically just kind of delayed the conversations that you probably would have had if you had lost in the first round to Orlando. Obviously, it's great to get a playoff series win, right? After what happened last year, but it just still feels like that those two guys can't play together. And like if I'm the Cavs, I would probably just decide to just since Mobley's the guy we drafted, like just build around him and probably see if you can move Allen.
Yeah,
Um,
because Allen would have some tremendous, value. I think that's another
right.
key thing, and it's like that
Yeah,
now you don't know if your front court can coexist or your back court. I mean, Cleveland's in a rough spot, but I
right.
think it's
Yeah.
games like this where you feel amazing about them.
Yeah, and even like in Okoro, I'm curious what happens with him in the offseason because I think he's a restricted free agent because I think this is year 4.
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah. So he's basically a free agent. So I'm kind of
yeah,
curious to see, what happens with him, like whether or not he, you know, stays or, goes or whatever. Cause, eventually it'll get to be a pretty expensive roster. Um, and, how much are you going to be willing to pay for a team where their ceiling probably is like first round victory, and then after that, probably not much further.
yeah.
I
It's a
don't, I
toss
don't
up.
know. Yeah, yeah, but yeah, this is his 4th season, so
Yep.
um, so he either stays here long term or he goes elsewhere. I don't know, but I would have assumed if they were pretty comfortable with keeping him, they would have already extended him. But we'll see. But
Yeah.
either way, we'll talk more about Cleveland's offseason. When and if they get eliminated. But yeah,
Sure.
like that, I just feel like with this game, a lot of the shots that Boston made in game 1, just swap it to Cleveland in game 2, right? Because
Yeah.
it was a lot of ridiculous shot making.
Mm.
Um, More so, I think like the Celtics one was just insane. Like Derek White hitting like step back, behind the back
Yeah.
threes or whatever. Like that was just insane.
Right.
Like this one, there was some good process on some of these threes where they did get some good looks. I mean, even Mobley hit a three, and I mean he was wide open. But just in general, yeah, Mitchell hit a couple of threes, but you could tell, like, the game plan I think was different in this one. I did like how they got Mobley the ball because that's
Hmm.
your best chance to win. Like, if he's out there, he needs to play very well on both ends of the floor. Because if just basically gives you like 8 and 10, that's not enough,
Right.
right? Like
With
he
like
needs to
five
get
blocks, like we
yeah,
need him on offense, man. He's got to be
right,
a
yeah,
factor. Because I mean, you think about
exactly,
it. It's Al Horford. And I'm not trying to say that like to disrespect Al Horford, but I'm saying
right,
that to put some respect on Evan Mobley's name. Like, come on, bro. Like we
yeah,
know that you have the tools. It just comes down to the execution, I think.
and it's also like 37-year-old Al Horford, so it's like
Right.
now older and slower, even though he's still like a solid player, right? Like you shouldn't look at that matchup and be like, "Oh, I'm just in a pickle right
Shouldn't
now."
get
So,
outplayed by him. Simple.
yeah, right, exactly.
Porzingis, I'll give you a pass on that, but uh, Al Horford, no shot.
Right. So we'll see. Because obviously now, yeah, it moves back to Cleveland. Where they have not lost a home game yet. So we'll see if that, continues in games 3 and 4. But if you're the Cavs, that's all you ask for is you get the split and then you go back home, see what happens. We assume Boston's gonna respond, but you just never know. Because again, they were very hot from 3. So you never know. You could just all of a sudden have like, you know, 2, 3 bad shooting games that all of a sudden just kind of change what happens.
Yeah, and it's like with Boston, I think they tried to respond in this game a little bit, by going back to the easy stuff. I think problem with Boston is sometimes they don't do the basics, you know? When the three isn't hitting, you need to attack the rim and create simple shots. And they don't normally do that. They kind of just continue to try and force their way into threes. And
Yeah,
that's probably not the most ideal situation in the
yeah.
playoffs.
I did think there was a lot of forced possessions because there was some really bad Jaylen Brown possessions, I think, because he had like a couple of even there's some awful white possessions too, where you could tell he was just like, "Well, I'm off. Let me see if I can get back in a rhythm," and it wasn't working. And then
Right.
Brown, he had like the one play I think it was at the end of the first half where he just fumbled the ball and gave it to Okoro.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Okoro, and then he had the free throw to tie it up at halftime. But yeah, that like that's not the Celtics offense, right? Like the Celtics offense is when they're spreading the ball around, drive and kick, smart playmaking. Like that's the that creates the wide open advantages. Like that's the offense, right? Like obviously you'll need stretches late in the game where like Brown or Tatum are gonna have to attack the mismatches, but for most of the game, like you don't, that's not really what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally, for like the perfect Celtics game, right?
Yeah.
This was a pretty bad one, right? Which is again kind of weird that their two worst performances of the playoffs were both at home, right? Because I think they were 37-4 or whatever it was, at home in the regular season,
Mm-hmm.
and then they've already lost two in the playoffs to teams that they probably shouldn't be losing at home to. So we'll see.
Yeah.
And then moving on, we also had Mavs OKC. We're recording this on Sunday, so both game twos for Cavs, Celtics, and Mavs OKC wrapped up. We did talk about game one of Mavs OKC in the live stream. So obviously, for some, I guess, more unscripted, you know, immediate reaction thoughts, you can check that out.
Yeah.
But we talked about it where we thought OKC played a pretty impressive game one, where they had contributions from a lot of guys across the board. Jalen Williams in the fourth, right? But obviously other guys like SGA, Chet Holmgren, Aaron Wiggins off the bench was great, right? They got a lot of contributions from bench guys. But you didn't really get that from the Mavs, right? And also you had again a very bad Luka game, and a relatively quiet Kyrie game for the most part, other than the third quarter. But in game two, it flipped, right? OKC ended up losing their first playoff game, and it was also at home in game two.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because I think going into this game, we thought OKC was going to win. It was pretty back and forth early on. You could see Dallas kind of had the early advantage. Obviously, Luka was much better in this game than he was in the first game, which is where you start. But then you also got a lot of contributions from other guys that you weren't like PJ Washington at 27. I know he fouled out, but he was really good in that game. He had a lot of really good opportunities where there were a lot of open looks, some contested ones as well. But um, that was kind of the story of the game, for OKC on defense. Just a lot of bizarre decisions on both ends of the floor where you could kind of see, all right, this is where, some people would feel like, yeah, this is the young team, inexperienced moments. Also, Dallas shot the lights out of the ball as well, right? There was a turning point in the third quarter where Luka and Kyrie, right, they sit out. Kyrie's out for like one possession. He comes back in. They take Luka out because he's pretty clear. He was kind of hobbling because he was kind of limited in the second quarter and early in the third.
Yeah.
But then they brought in Tim Hardaway Jr. and he scores like 10 quick points off the bench, right? I think he made a three, got fouled in another three. And I think he got like a mid range or whatever. And he's the type of guy where like, he's either hot or cold. And when he
Yeah.
gets hot, it really adds a little bit of a spark to Dallas. And other role players showed up as well, right? Josh Green hit some big threes. Um, I think what was it? Gafford, right? He had a few moments at different points, right, where you could see he was kind of overwhelming Chet, somewhat, right? So I mean, yeah, it was kind of weird, but even despite all that, there was a stretch where OKC took a brief lead early in the third, right? Because we talked about that, where I mentioned, they took out Luca and Kyrie. They started Wiggins in the second half over Giddy, right? He didn't really play much, and I think that's kind of another interesting thing to see, right? He only played, you know, 11 minutes and was a minus 20 in those 11 minutes, which is pretty difficult to do, for the most part.
Yeah.
Especially again, minus 20 and a 9-point loss. It was a game that was pretty, back and forth, right? Neither team led by a ton for most of the game. But it was weird because it felt like at one point OKC was gonna pull it out in the second half, and then they just imploded. But you also give credit to Dallas on both ends of the floor. Like I said, Luca being great um during the inner and outer stretches of the game, right? Kind of helped, obviously, because you need him to be really good if you want to win this series. So now Dallas did what they needed to do and they got the series split. Um, but yeah, it was just kind of weird because there were just, some interesting performances by some guys. Because like I said, Chet was pretty bad. Um, Dort got into foul trouble, which was a problem. But even when he was out there, couldn't really stop Luca for the most part. Um, but yeah, so we'll see what happens. But I feel like it's going to be interesting with the Giddy piece because I wonder if he starts in game 3. Because usually, like you make the adjustment after you lose game 1, not win game 1 and then lose
Right.
game 2. But it is something to think about because, again, early in the first quarter, right, Dallas went out to a lead because it was just a lot of Josh Giddy, where it was like they were leaving him open. And he wasn't shy about shooting it, right, which is okay, but he wasn't making them. And that's the problem, I think, if you're OKC. So I wonder if they make the switch where they switch him out and either bring him off the bench or just don't play him at all. I don't know. But it's something to think about, right? Because if he's not going to play well, it's just really hard to play him because you have other guard options like Hasten Wallace, right? Because they had a mini run where SGA was off the floor and they cut it to 4. And, I think some people might have said, all right, let's bring him back in. They didn't bring him in because, sometimes the coach will be like, let's run with the guys that were brought
Yes.
us in.
Yes.
And it didn't work, right? Then Dallas went right back up to like a 9-11 lead. And then it was pretty much done. So we'll see. Like OKC's, non-Shea guys, I think are going to have to be better for the most part. Obviously, they're going to have to shoot better. I mean, they were 10 of 30 from 3, which isn't horrible, but, you know, it is when the other team shoots 50%, right? That's the issue right there. So they're going to need to be better on both ends of the floor. But, we thought this would go 6 or 7 regardless anyways. So, I don't know if this makes you feel discouraged by your pick. I'm still
No.
sticking with
No.
OKC,
I'm
as our
I'm fine.
pick. But yeah, it was just kind of an interesting game, I think,
Yeah.
because obviously it felt like at one point that OKC might go up 2-0. Because if they had won this game, I think the series probably would have been a wrap because you got everything you would have needed if you're Dallas on the road to win. So if they had lost, that would have been rough. Other than obviously Kyrie was pretty quiet, even though he helped out on defense, but
Yeah.
still.
Yeah, and it's like, the way that I look at this game in this series now, I think, the 1-1 split is very telling. I think it shows us that it's going to be a close competitive series because of, the things that you were talking about in the inexperience with OKC. The biggest concern I have, though, is PJ Washington pretty much being the third best player on the floor in this game. I'm expecting J-Dub or Chet, even maybe Kyrie. I'm expecting these guys to kind of be on that level. But, hey, PJ Washington, he did his thing like you were talking about. And, this is something that we talked about in the live stream and going into this series was, the complementary players. It's going to be tough. What are you going to get from your bench guys? What are you going to get from your role players? And, Dallas's guys, they showed up like you talked about. Tim Hardaway, he showed up like a microwave. That's what you need. Whereas, Chet and J-Dub didn't really do all that much. I guess you could be more happy about J-Dub's performance because I think, he's efficient from the 3, did a lot on defense, and obviously is their energy guy. But at the end of the day, I think you needed a little bit more. Even a guy like Gordon Hayward, he doesn't play, and that's kind of unexpected, I think. He's a vet. Who you would think would have a little bit left in the tank, but our loyal subscriber Homelander, I think he called him a waste of a roster spot. So that kind of tells you how OKC fans feel about him, and I'm sure how Oklahoma City feels about him right now. But like you were talking about, you need a lot more from Josh Giddey, I think. But it's hard to get that when when he's out there, he kind of looks a little lost, scared, in my opinion, nervous. I don't know what that is. But that can be a dangerous game when you're playing mental stuff. When people are daring you to shoot and you shoot it and you don't make it, I think it's a shot to his confidence for sure. But
Yeah,
overall, this game was wild. I think to see kind of like the mismatch hunting, the pick and roll stuff. That's kind of what we talked about as well. Where Luka Doncic, I think he had an amazing game. Definitely a bounce back one where he was efficient, did everything, didn't turn the ball over maybe one time, I think. And, he was hitting all his threes, which is the best version of Luka, and getting everybody else involved as well as getting the rebounds.
yeah,
But, they were hunting that switch between, him and Lou Dort, putting, Lou Dort somewhere else, maybe getting a guy like Chet on him, bait him a little bit. And, Chet kind of got bullied in this game, like you're talking about, whether it was Gafford, Luka, Lively as well. Because there was, I think, one play where Luka was on the break and he kind of just gave him a chicken wing and Chet pretty much like folded in half. And I was like, all right, well, I mean, that's how you take him out. But yeah, this is going to be a wild series. And, like we were talking about, I think this one has 7 games written all over it. It's just a matter of, Kyrie showing up. Because I think if Kyrie showed up, this would have been an even more wild game. But PJ Washington probably wouldn't have went off like he did.
I think
But yeah,
I think I think for OKC, I think the plan defensively was like, let's try, like, we're gonna try to limit Kyrie, at different points, and we might have to concede some shots to some of these other guys, and it didn't work, right?
yeah,
That was a problem. So,
left PJ
and
Washington wide open.
yeah, and I like some of what Dallas was doing on offense to kind of force OKC into kind of rotating defensively, and guys made some mistakes, and Dallas made them pay, right? Where like, you got guys like, getting good looks at the rim, or, some of the open threes where a guy, kind of messed up on a switch, or didn't communicate. So I liked a lot of the Dallas adjustments in this game, and especially again, you also got some help from some of the bench guys. Like I said, Tim Hardaway Jr. just coming out and just having a stretch without Luka was massive. That was kind of what helped Dallas win the game. Even though OKC got back into it, you just kind of knew, okay, if they were able to make a run with Luka on the bench, like that's probably going to be enough. And then there was like the other stretch in the fourth, I think, where Luka looked like he was hobbled, right?
Yeah,
Got the ball on offense, and then I was like, well, I'm not injured anymore. So
right.
because once you got the ball, I guess you don't feel as bad physically. Because
It
there was
happens, bro.
the other part where it was just like, wow, like if you're OKC, that's pretty brutal. That like there were a couple of possessions where it was really close, and he's out there on one leg, and you still couldn't take advantage. Or like
Yeah,
the dagger one where I think they the ball was loose, and then it got to like they got to stop. Then the ball got loose. They couldn't secure the ball, and Tim Hardaway Jr. gets a three in the corner, and then basically seals the game.
yeah.
Like
The bench's faces told the entire story. Like if you look at the replay on that, like they were pissed off, and I would be too.
right, yeah. So now OKC has to win in Dallas, at least one, because Dallas took back home court. So we'll see what happens. Because again, this can go either way, right? Because we saw Dallas lose, at home in the Clippers series, and they also won on the road. So we'll see. Like it just, like I said, and like you said, it really just kind of depends on, can other guys outside of Shea step up on both ends of the floor? Because I think Shea was good in this game. I know he had some stretches where it looked like he was kind of just trying to do it himself. But some of that was also just because it was pretty clear some guys just didn't have it.
Yeah,
So, he had what 12 rebounds. So clearly he was doing a lot on both ends of the floor. He had 2 blocks, a steal, 12 rebounds, 8 assists as well, right? Like you could tell once Giddy wasn't out there that it was like, all right, now it's basically all up to SGA for the most part. And that's where I think at a certain point they're probably just going to bench Giddy because I just feel like it, like if he's going to start, can't just play 10 minutes and like be
yeah,
a -20. I feel like it's coming at some point. I could be wrong, because again they won game one, but I don't know. You're trying to win this series, and at a certain point it may have to happen. We'll see because there have been some weird Dagnall decisions I think as well, like his challenges. I think
yeah.
so far in the second round haven't been all that great.
Hmm.
Um, but either way, again, you give credit, obviously to Dallas because they needed to win this game.
Yeah,
Because if they lost the game, again, we know when you're down 2-0, doesn't mean the series is over. It just makes it a lot more difficult to come back and win because you have to win 4 out of 5. Um, but now, it's tied. The series is tied, and it's anybody's series at this point. So
yes, sir.
that's what Dallas needs to do.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of what we expected. Like, not in
Yeah,
terms of in terms of Dallas winning this game, but how the series is kind of going to go back and forth, back and forth. Pretty much whoever wins in 6 or 7.
right. So now, obviously, this episode comes out on Friday. So on Friday, you'll also have some game threes, right? You'll have Knicks Pacers game 3. We already kind of talked about how we think it may go. It just kind of depends. And then you have game 3 of Denver, Minnesota, right? And obviously for Denver, this is a must-win game, right? Because obviously you lose this game, you're down 3-0, series is done, it's over, it's Jover.
Yep.
And I think there's gonna be a lot of questions, right, that are gonna start to be asked about how good Denver really is, and if they end up getting swept in this series. So we'll see, if Denver responds, right? Obviously, I think both stars. Honestly, I think in game 2 were pretty bad, and I honestly think they kind of just quit, including Jokic as well. Um, which isn't a good look. So we'll see if they respond in game 3. I think we feel like this series is pretty much a wrap at this point because you just can't lose both games in Denver the way they did. Because
Yes.
it didn't really feel because it didn't feel like the Cavs Celtics game or Miami Boston where it felt a little bit fluky where it's like, oh, these guys just canned a bunch of shots and the other team um just didn't come out to compete hard enough. But it felt like what Minnesota was doing was pretty sustainable, especially if Murray's just not going to give you much of anything. Obviously, we know he's going to play. We didn't expect him to be suspended. I know he got fined 100K.
Yeah.
Obviously, some people feel that way, but I didn't expect him to be because just we hadn't seen it in the postseason this year, right? Because
Yeah.
we talked about Embiid where it was like he didn't get tossed, he didn't get suspended. So it was probably pretty unlikely that that was going to happen with Murray, even though again, there's reasons for and against it, right? So we'll see. But what do you think happens in this game? Because, like I said, I would think if I'm the Nuggets, that you have to respond and you kind of have to show, hey, we're the defending champs. We got the best player in the world. We're not just gonna, go down without a fight. Because I think this might have to be like a Jokic takes like a 25 to 30 shots type of game. I know he doesn't like to do that, but that may have to be what has to happen. If Jamal Murray doesn't show up, but yeah, what do you think, ultimately happens? Because again, with Minnesota, they're feeling pretty great. They're obviously very confident. Um, they have energy pretty much everywhere, and everybody's playing pretty well in this series. It's getting minutes. So yeah, I don't. What do you think?
And it's tough. It's a tough call. I think with the Nuggets, they they're stars. They need to and should play at the best level that they possibly can. The problem is, will they? Who knows? It really all comes down to Jamal Murray, I think, because Jokic, we all know he kind of feeds off of Jamal Murray, and they both feed off of each other in all reality. But their problem really, honestly, comes down to Anthony Edwards as well. How do you limit that guy? Because he seems to kind of just tear them up on all three
Yeah,
levels. They don't have an answer for him, which is really, really tough. You can't
yeah,
really figure out where he's going because it seems like he'll stop, pop, or he'll just go straight downhill because we all know Jokic is not a good defender. Anthony Edwards is a smart offensive player to the point where he's not going to get baited by Jokic's body, by him just kind of standing there or something like that. And now that Anthony Edwards can play make, it's a whole different
yeah,
animal than what we saw last year, and maybe even some games during the regular season because the guy has gotten so much better. But at the end of the day, you need your stars to play better. Aaron Gordon needs to show up. Michael Porter Jr. needs to show up, and you need to make a statement away. But at the end of the day, I don't think it matters because even if they do win this game, I think the series is pretty much a wrap. Just because you did end up fumbling both games at home, which is something that's very uncharacteristic. I've never seen a team defending champion this rattled, I think, in a long time. We've seen, defending champs go out sad before, but this is a
yeah,
different level of rattled, I think. They don't have an answer for anything
yeah.
offensively or defensively. But at the end of the day, they do need to stick to their game. I think that's what makes them strong. Stick to the basics. And I know it's tough because Minnesota's defensive personnel are amazing. They've done everything the right way, and they've played defense immaculately to the point where they've taken both stars out of the game, in which we thought was not possible this season. We thought Denver looked unstoppable, but the Timberwolves, they kind of shown us that maybe the Nuggets aren't all that we thought that they were. But it all comes down to consistency, and with Jamal Murray, I think you can clearly tell he's hurt. He's not himself, but he needs to power through because I think the whole city of Denver is counting on him for this game specifically.
Right, because again, it's not even just defensively, right? Where like offensively, Minnesota has looked better, as well. Like they look like the more organized, composed team. Where like Denver just looks like they don't know what to do. And like you said
Right.
with Edwards, it's just you know easy attacks, easy probes, right? Easy decisions to make. Even Towns, right? Who we didn't really know if he had it in him, right? You can see he's been elevated right by Edwards, where he's playing smart. At least on offense, right? He's playing
Yeah.
smart. He's playing downhill. Even defensively, like he's guarding Jokic, pretty effectively. I
He's
know.
dumbed his game down, in my opinion.
Yeah, right. Like, and I know, like he's committed some silly fouls, but I think he's been good in this series,
Yes, very.
so far in
And
a
the
way
second
that
best
like
player.
exactly right, exactly in a way that like yeah, if Edwards and Towns are the two best players, that equals a Minnesota series win because in theory, if you're the Nuggets, Jokic has got to be the best player on the floor, and then Murray has to be you know at worst three. You know what I
Sure.
mean? So I think that's kind of the issue. I mean, obviously in the last round, I would say he was 4, right behind both LeBron and AD. But
Yeah, I would agree.
you know, yeah. But in this scenario, right, like this is supposed to be quote unquote a lesser duo.
Right.
Because of Towns, not really because of Edwards. So that's the part where I'm kind of curious to see because again, if they are who everybody, including us, believe them to be, they should not get swept, right?
No,
Like,
you
and I
can't.
know, like, yeah, like sometimes you have, just a bad matchup, which Minnesota probably is just a bad matchup for them. And we've seen, stars have some pretty bad playoff series and performances. We've seen it before. It's happened to literally everybody. But yeah, and we'll talk about it obviously whenever the series ends, right? Because like I said, if the Nuggets lose, I think that pretty much opens up a lot of conversations on, like you said, and like I said, maybe they may just not be what we thought. But I don't know. Like it's just hard to describe because I feel like if you're the Nuggets, you almost have to respond, but there may just not be an answer because sometimes we've seen teams over the course of NBA history just kind of just arrive right without any real warnings per se. They just kind of show up right, even if
Right.
they have like a good regular season. Sometimes it'll be like, oh, they had a nice regular season, but no way they win like multiple rounds or whatever. Like it was cute in the regular season, but this is the playoffs, and then they just show up. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of possibilities to be opened up. If Minnesota just destroys the defending champs and just basically sends them packing in a quick 4 or 5 game series. But we're not there yet. But
Yeah.
we both said it at the time after game one. We were like, yeah, if they lose game two, probably done.
Yeah.
And it feels like you said, even if the Nuggets bounce back and win game three, it's probably done. But you at least give the Nuggets a shot because, like I said, they have quote unquote, the best player in the world, and he needs to be better. I think it starts really with him, right?
Yeah.
Because like if he has like an all-time performance game, that may be enough, to uplift everyone else. But if he doesn't have it, then it's game over.
Right. And that's the key. Cuz and I just don't know what the answer really is. Like you were talking about cuz I think, the Nuggets they play a simple game of basketball. It's really a lot of pick and roll, a lot of cutting, and a lot of guys just knowing their roles. Simple as that. But the Minnesota Timberwolves have taken them out of their comfort zone and I don't think people expected that and I think it's been the biggest surprise of the playoffs thus far for sure. To the point where we're going to have some tough conversations if they really do get eliminated. But at the end of the day, hey, it's basketball and it is a game of, whoever has the hot hand. It's a game of runs. It's a game of everything, And I think, Minnesota, they've done what we thought was pretty much impossible to this point. Like you were talking about, though, it's first to four, not first to two. So, but yeah, Nuggets they have to respond, and I don't know if they do because I'm just wary of talking about the Nuggets as if they're going to come back because we talked
Exactly.
about Phoenix as if they were going to come back, and
Yeah.
then like that
Yeah.
that just went down the drain
Yeah. I
immediately.
knew I knew it was over after the second game because it was just
Sure.
like, wow, Towns and Edwards weren't even that good, and you still lost by a lot. So like that was when and again, it's like Denver, right? Where it's like, okay, game one, maybe a team catches you by surprise, maybe you just get outplayed.
Hmm.
But game two is the one where you have to respond and you have to pull that one out. But
Right.
if you proceed to get destroyed in game two, even worse. Because at least in game one, you could have at least said like there was a pathway, because that game one was a lot more competitive, between Minnesota and Denver. Because
Yes.
it was a pretty back and forth game until, like midway ish through the fourth.
Yes.
But game two was pretty much done after like, 15 minutes. I mean, like that was basically like, if you were, like I don't know, not a fan of either team, you were just like, yeah, there's no point in watching the second half of this game.
Right.
But just in general, yeah, it's been so impressive to see what Minnesota has done, and it's just again, a lot of it is really due to the ascension of Edwards. In addition to everybody, kind of being able to find their way in terms of their playing their roles to a T on both ends, because obviously their defense gets a lot of credit, but the offense, as I think they've had the number one offense in the playoffs so far, for the most right, pretty much through the playoffs, right, which again was not supposed to be their strength, but it's really worked out for them. And then, like even with I guess, people have talked about the changes in the officiating, right? Where it's like now you can be a lot more physical defensively than you were able to, in previous seasons, and that helps them too, because obviously that's their strength. in terms of what they can do defensively. So, if you're, a team that doesn't really respond well to physical, you got some problems if you're going against Minnesota, right? Because they're flying up and down, they're getting into you. And it's impressive to see. It's like one of the best defensive performances that I've seen in recent memory. Obviously, like we haven't been around for 50 plus years, so there were other teams that obviously were elite defensively.
Right.
But of the ones that I can recall, this is up there. It's like one of the three best.
Yeah, and the clip that's sticking in my head is the one where Jamal Murray's kind of bringing up the ball as he normally would.
Yep.
He's getting full court press by Nikhil Alexander-Walker, and then all of a sudden you see Jaden McDaniels come from the left, and then he's trying to throw the elbows and get the ball out, but he can't because they're too long. And they're so good on defense. And we talked about this in the live stream. We talked about it in the last episode. I think, the commentators, they were talking about it. Like, there feels like there's 7-8 guys out there when Minnesota's kind of playing that zone defense and doubling and trapping, just forcing, Denver to make mistakes that they normally wouldn't make. And I think that's due to the fact that they have some great defensive personnel, and they're executing. Simple as that, really.
Yeah, we'll see. Do you think Jamal Murray should have been suspended, or are you just more of the mindset of like, it's whatever? Not it's whatever, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I get you. I think there's an argument that could be made for both sides. And if you want me to be real, I think he should have. We've seen guys, get suspended for some things that were kind of odd. We saw Draymond get suspended. Obviously, we're not comparing, and I'm not trying to compare Draymond, stomping somebody out to a guy throwing an ice pack and a towel at a ref, but I think there's a certain level of respect that you do have to carry yourself with. And I don't think, just because you're not getting the right calls, just because you're frustrated, just because your team is not executing and you personally are not playing to the best of your ability that we know that you can, doesn't mean that you kind of have to throw a fit like a toddler and then throw, towels onto the floor and heat packs. I just don't think that's a good look for you, your organization, or the NBA as a whole, because I don't think that should be tolerated, because I don't want anybody else to kind of outburst like they're a child or anything like that. So I think a suspension would have been good, but at the end of the day, if they suspend Jamal Murray, series is done. That's the problem. But I guess that's kind of the price that you would kind of pay for acting out like a child. But yeah. I get the other side where it's like, just give him a fat fine, because $100K is crazy for that. But I mean, either way, it never is going to satisfy everybody. It's always going to be a lose-lose, whatever the case may be. But I do understand where people are calling for the suspension. I wouldn't say I would call for it, but I think he should have been suspended. Like, I'm not up in arms about the fact that he got a fine. The fine is fine,
Yeah, I'm basically where you are.
Yeah.
Like, from the perspective of like, yeah, like he probably should have been suspended. I think it definitely would have happened if it was a regular season game, right? Kind of like the Embiid thing, where I think he would have gotten a flagrant 2 or whatever it was.
Right.
That was a regular season game. But I don't know, because like I know in the last couple of years, it seems like they used, I guess, sort of like precedent, like in terms of previous behavior as well. Like, I don't think he's really looked at as a guy that does like a lot of like, really bad stuff.
Fair.
You know what I mean? So that's maybe what they're looking at it. But I also would say like that wasn't good, because the guy could have literally tripped and fallen on it.
Right.
Could have gotten hurt. And like you said, it's just kind of just like a immature type of thing to do, where it's like, yeah, we get it. We know you're getting your butt kicked, but like, come on, like you shouldn't do that. And that's another reason why it also kind of feels like that they probably are going to lose the series, because stuff like that makes you feel like, okay, they probably don't have much internal belief at this point that they can realistically win. Because I mean, like, we just, how often do you see something like, like we've seen like players like on the bench just like not be very happy, or like players walk out, like when the game is basically over or whatever. But like throwing stuff, like that's kind of a new one for me.
Yeah, I mean, you would kind of expect that from a fan, like a bad fan, not the good kind of fan, but a bad fan who maybe had a little bit too much to drink. But at the end of the day, I think, with this situation though, it's funny because the body language was very off. Anytime there were any whistles or no whistles called, Jamal Murray flings up a bad shot. Let's just take that for example. Then he looks over at the ref, and then, he's kind of just stomping on the floor like a toddler. And then, you look at Mike Malone. I
Yeah.
guess that was an odd situation. I mean, the guy ran up on the ref, and shout out to the
Yeah.
ref, because if a guy is fuming, red, very angry, the steam is coming out of his ears, and he's yelling at me and in my face like that, and he needs to be held back by his players and coaching staff. I'm putting that tee up immediately. I'm giving him the tech. But shout out to the
Right.
ref, I guess, for having a lot of composure. But
Yeah.
that's another thing. You can see it's like a trickle down thing. And I get it. If you're not getting the calls, you have the right to be angry. But don't let the world see it, because I think it's a very bad look, especially when you're down. And you're getting to that point of no return where you have no response for anything on the court. Then we start getting into like off the court kind of stuff, where throwing things at people and getting in people's spaces. It's not a good look, in my opinion.
No. Yeah, no, not at all. Yeah, so that's part of the reason why I think we're both calculating, like probably done.
Yep.
And again, we'll have those conversations about the Nuggets when we get there.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, what a showing for Minnesota so far, and what a second round so far. Obviously, I think we both feel like whoever wins the Nuggets Wolves series, right, probably going to come out of the West, and I think more than likely win the title.
Yes.
Could be completely wrong. I think for Boston, at least, it kind of depends on Porzingis. I think you need to be healthy. Like I think they would have a better chance of beating Minnesota if they had Porzingis. But if he's either not playing or just not 100%, I don't know, that's kind of tough.
Yeah.
Kind of back to where you were last season. Although you have some guys that are playing better, like Derek White, Holiday, but
Yeah.
you got him so you could help. So he could help you in a championship, not just so he could help you in a bunch of regular season games.
For sure, yeah. And it's like, I feel like with Boston, the other thing, which I kind of hinted at, was Tatum's play has been a little subpar to me. I'm expecting bigger things, bigger games from him, more efficiency. And I get it, high volume of threes. And he's doing a lot more. And I think he's stepped up in some roles and in some aspects where, the rebounding is really good. The playmaking has gotten better. But the efficiency has dropped, and that kind of scares me, because I think, if he comes up short in a couple of games, if they do, and probably when they do get to the finals, I think that could be, the dagger, where it's like, say we're talking about a Minnesota-Boston finals, and Anthony Edwards is the best player on the floor out there still, and
Yeah.
Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum combined have no answer for Anthony Edwards. Like, it's a wrap, and I could really see that happening, especially if they don't have Porzingis. That's the really tough part.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's where it gets kind of interesting. Where Minnesota has continued to elevate themselves over the course of the season, which has been impressive to see. And it's wild because I know early in the season they had pretty decent advantage in the 1 seed. Because they were the 1 seed for a while, and then kind of dropped off a little bit. But yeah, this is not like a 3 seed. This is like, because again, the top 3 seeds all basically are. I think OKC and Denver basically have the same record.
Yes.
And then Minnesota had, I think, one less win.
They were all
one
neck
more
and neck.
loss, right? Yeah, so they were all basically neck and neck pretty much all year. So we know these are probably 3 of your best teams in the West, but we'll see if Dallas puts up a fight.
Yes, sir.
And we'll see if Denver puts up a fight.
Yes, sir.
So now obviously we have some more, news stuff going around. So I guess should we get into the coach hiring or firing first?
Let's go with the firing.
Okay, so obviously I think that's the bigger story. So
Yes.
for the Phoenix Suns, after hiring him on a 5-year deal, after 1 year, they fired Frank Vogel. And supposedly, according to Woj, I believe they said that Mike Budenholzer seems to be like he's the front runner, that he's probably going to get in, which is very interesting, right? Because it wasn't that long ago when we talked about him getting fired from his previous stop in Milwaukee. Um, I don't know. It's kind of interesting because again, you look at the Suns team, they won 49 games, which is cool, right? Despite a bunch of guys being in and out of the lineup. But we saw what happened in the playoffs where you could tell the big three just didn't fit. Their $50 million player, Bradley Beal, just didn't show up for most of the series. Wasn't good, which is a problem. And he quit at the end of the last game. But, either way, but somehow that's all Vogel's fault. So obviously he gets canned. And he obviously wasn't great. It seemed like that he had kind of lost the locker room as well. But I just don't necessarily know if Coach Bud is like the solution to the problem, because we saw him coach the Bucks. We saw him have a lot of issues, right? Against the Heat. I know Giannis was banged up, but they had leads in those fourth quarters, And we watched this. He didn't really make adjustments. He didn't switch up the matchup to at least put somebody that was kind of big enough to guard Jimmy Butler. We saw him go away from Giannis and Brook Lopez pick and roll, and instead it was just, other weird random stuff like Grayson Allen ISOs and whatnot. So
Mm-hmm.
very strange. And again, we know his strengths and weaknesses as a coach because we know he can build like a relatively competent offense, which probably you would assume would help Phoenix. And then like defensively, we know his strategies, right, where he is, I guess, okay with giving up threes, at the expense of like making sure you're not getting to the rim. Um, so I don't know. I don't think it makes a significant difference. But I understand the thought process of like, okay, he lost the locker room, so he has to go. Um, but yeah, I don't know. Assuming they hire him, I mean, like I guess in theory he might be the best coach available, but only because I don't really know a lot of the other coaches, and also a lot of the other ones don't really have experience or in a head coaching role other than like a couple. So I don't know, kind of interesting. We knew it was coming, um, but the Bootnolls are hiring, I think, or alleged hiring, right? If it happens, kind of caught me off guard. But again, there are things to like and things not to like because again, we've seen him before. We know what he does.
Yeah, and it's like, you were talking about it. The personnel on the team for the Suns was just not enough. You didn't have enough in the tank, and the thing that really sucks is you're going to be above that apron. So you can't really add on to it because you're going to be paying three guys a whole lot of money, and you're gonna get hit with some limitations. So it's not really going to get much better. But what I did find interesting was DeJounte Murray's reaction to kind of like the firings and hirings, where he's like, when do we kind of hold the players accountable? And I think he's right to a certain extent, where he's talking more so about like where like why is the coach kind of the first guy to be blamed? That's kind of how it is because at the end of the day, the teams are kind of running the systems of the coaches. This is the coach's rotation, and yeah, at times like guys like Frank Vogel, like that sometimes you could tell it's a bad rotation, bad plays. You
Yeah.
never really want to have Kevin Durant sitting in the corner, but at the end of the day, you can kind of understand that where do have Devin Booker and Bradley Beal, two guys who I guess we thought were capable of doing some damage, but clearly that didn't translate into the playoffs for some of them. But I do understand why they fired him. But for sure a scapegoat move because at the end of the day, the big three didn't show up in majority of their games in the playoffs. I think maybe two out of the three of them probably showed up in the last game, but overall, they weren't cohesive. They looked okay in the regular season. I think you saw a lot of potential, and I think people fell in love with the potential, and so did kind of the organization. And I think they're still in love with it, or else they wouldn't have fired Vogel, because they really think that he's the problem. And I do get it. Maybe you do bring in a guy who's better, but is like you asked, is Bud really the answer? I don't think
Right.
so. I don't know what you would do from here because I think the roster as it's currently constructed is just not enough to win a championship. You can't go on three guys and just everybody else kind of just fills in. I think you need a solid system where at the most probably a very high end duo, and then everybody else is really really good at their role and their job. But three guys I think is a little bit too much considering the
Right.
CBA that we're in.
Yeah, and that's the tough part where it's like I think, a big three can work. It's just a matter of the three has to be a good fit, but then you also have to factor in like, especially now financially, can you even build that? Right. Because that's kind of the issue. And I think like in addition to three fitting together, I think at least two of them I think have to be two-way guys as opposed to like,
100%.
just one. Um and again, you still have to be able to build, rotations around them. You have like decent role players. But again, once you do that, and you're talking about three, 40, $50 million players, that's just probably not doable, especially in today's NBA. So that's where it may not be, if it just may not be feasible, and that's where
Yeah.
like also like drafting comes into play as well, right? Which is probably like, I guess a potential way down the line to build a big three, but that's not always a guarantee because there's no guarantee that the person that you can draft three stars at different points, right? Like, OKC seems like they're on their way to drafting, like they've drafted three guys that have, star potential. I mean, one which is already a superstar, but that's just not the norm. And so I think like with the Suns, again, I feel like kind of like with the Clippers, you're kind of like forced into a position where you're just gonna have to probably build around it. I mean, if the Nuggets get swept, does that make the Suns feel better?
No,
Maybe. I mean,
not to me.
like I guess it's like, oh wow, the defending champs got swept, so maybe like even so maybe us getting swept by Minnesota also isn't bad. It's just I guess the issue is if I'm the Suns, how do you get better other than just the coaching? Because as you and I have already talked about, there's issues beyond coaching that plague this team. Like you have to find ways to just get better personnel on both ends of the floor, and I just don't know how you really do that because once that second apron penalty stuff comes in, it becomes really tough. We already talked about it. You can't sign buyout guys. You can't do like 2-for-1 trades. You can't do, you can't necessarily like send out, you have your salaries have to match like exactly or whatever. So, I mean, like, I don't know. I mean, we'll see. But
Right.
but as we know, right? It always kind of starts with the coach. The coach is always the first person to go because the GM isn't going to fire themselves, right, for
Right.
putting together the roster. And then obviously the owner or team governor or whatever isn't going to step down and just be like, "Oh, I did a bad job, so I guess I'm not going to own the team anymore." Like
Right.
that's not happening. So,
Right.
so they're kind of married to this roster. So we'll see, where it goes from here. But it just doesn't feel good. I think like if you're a Suns fan, I feel like you're probably pretty disappointed with how the last few years have gone because it felt like you were kind of on your way to building like a pretty sustainable roster that where you could just kind of like tweak it over time. But now it feels like you're in a spot where you're probably just in a hole where you might honestly just be kind of just stuck.
Yeah. And like
Uh,
Vogel kind of losing like the two head jobs in the past 3 years is kind of wild to think about, especially post like a crazy, weird, I guess you could call it, blockbuster trade where, there are some very big questions, I think, about the trades that went down. And then the coach gets fired. Maybe he had some sort of pull in that, but I highly doubt it. I think this
right.
was more of a GM and stars kind of deal, similar to the Lakers one where you talk about LeBron and AD really wanting Westbrook, and then he shows up, and then Vogel's out of there. So it is kind of interesting how the way things go, but it is what it is. Because at the end of the day, like I said when I first started talking about it, was you're playing under the coach's system. These are his rotations. This is his system, and you failed miserably on both ends of the floor. So I
Yeah.
get it.
Yeah, and that's rough if you're vocal because, like you said, two stops that you were fired from where you were brought in expecting to bring in a championship, and he did. Right for the Lakers, they won a
Yeah,
title his first year as the head coach, and then obviously then they got worse each year. Again, a lot of that wasn't necessarily his fault, right? Because there were injuries and just you know, and then the last year just wasn't a good roster.
yeah.
But then for the Suns, it's year one of a 5-year deal. Everybody's feeling great, and then
And he was
not
confident about coming back. And
yeah,
now the
exactly.
West is loaded. So I think this is kind of the worst time to be dealing with issues like this because
Yeah,
every other team that's above you is probably going to get even better next year. And the ones below
right.
you for sure are going to get better.
Yeah, 'cause that's the other problem. It's like you said, it's not just the teams above you; it's the teams below you have a chance to pass you, and then you're really stuck, right? Because they were still able to be the 6th seed, but is there a guarantee that they're going to be a 6th seed next season? Like
They're a playing
maybe,
team next season.
yeah. I mean, like of course, maybe you could say, all right, if all three guys are healthier next year, is that a guarantee? Not necessarily.
They
Um,
just barely got out of the play in this year.
right.
So,
Yeah, and we've already talked about it, right? Where we're like, okay, look at some of the teams that were below them, right? Like like New Orleans obviously was below them, right? They were what 8,
mhm.
and they lost in the play-in, right? The Lakers were below them. Um, 9, right, was Sacramento, right? I'm assuming we think that bless you that they
Thank
might
you.
have a better season next year. We'll see. Um, or maybe they're the same. But then even after that, right? Like Golden State was 10. Are they 10 next year? They could be, but they might not be. But then after that is where the real questions come in, because then that's where you see like Houston, right? Where we assume they'll probably be better than they were this season, right? Memphis for sure, if they can at least have like average help, right? They should be a playoff team, play in team at worst.
Yeah.
Um, And then after that, right, like the Spurs, right? Like, I mean, they have, Wembanyama, right, in year one, who just won Rookie of the Year and was second in Defensive Player of the Year. So, and this could be the worst he'll ever be. So that's what you have to factor in. They're going to add talent, right? The only potentially like awful team next year might be Portland, right?
Sure.
Like, I mean, like the Spurs may still be bad, but like they'll be a team where you're not just going to be able to just walk in and win
Right.
because they're going to have a guy that's like, entering that tier of like elite
Oh yeah.
superstardom.
Heck yeah.
That's going to be a problem for the Suns. And then obviously on the other end, we have a coach hiring, right, where Charlotte hired Charles Lee, which was interesting because I think Charlotte broke it before anyone else was able to put it out. Like it wasn't Woj or Shams or anyone that broke it. It was Charlotte. I don't know much about him. I know he was an assistant, I believe, in Boston. Um, and I guess he was one of their top assistants. So we'll see what he's able to do with Charlotte because they've made a decent amount of changes, right? Obviously, they've made some roster changes, right, where they made some trades at the deadline, right, where they sent out guys like PJ Washington, um, and others, right? Obviously, they also had the ownership change, right, last year, right? Jordan's not the majority owner anymore, and they had front office changes, right? It's not Mitch Kupchak, right? It's another guy, right? A newer, younger guy. So they've made a lot of changes. So now they've got their head coach. So we'll see what they do in the draft, right? The draft lottery will be Sunday. So obviously we'll be talking about that in our next episode. But yeah, so we'll see what he does because he's got obviously an interesting task on his hands because he'll be in charge, I guess, of stewarding the Charlotte quote unquote rebuild, right? Because they had a couple of okay seasons where they were a playing team, and then they've just had a bunch of injuries and they've just evolved from there. But they do have some talent, outside of LaMelo Ball, right? Because you got Brandon Miller, who was really good as a rookie. Mark Williams barely played at all this season because he had back issues. So we'll see who they add in the draft and go from there.
Yeah, and bringing in young talent, I think, is always amazing across any sport because I think it does kind of show you not just the changing of the guard in terms of the players, but the coaches as well. Like in the NFL, we've got a ton of young coaches who, are going to the playoffs, every single season now, and I think that's kind of going to be the case. With the NBA as well, you got Dagnall, who's pretty young as well. So Lee's only like 39, so
Yeah,
that's kind of cool. And he was like you were talking about Joe Mazzulla's top assistant, and before that, I think he was on Budenholzer's staff. So that could be interesting, but I think it's kind of a cool mix. I think of ideologies that we're kind of going to see play out, and I think it's going to be a really interesting fit for the Hornets. And I think bringing in youth there, I think is going to be an interesting factor as well because it may
yeah,
be a guy that they can kind of relate to a little bit more and maybe want to play for because I think being a coach's or having being able to like be a player's coach, I think is one of the most like amazing things ever because you can kind of see when teams really want to play for their coach, it makes a huge difference.
exactly. I think that's something you got to factor in because, as you mentioned, right, there's a lot of young coaches that have popped around, the league that have done a really good job with their teams, and they have young teams as well that they kind of have to look over. And for a lot of these players, that matters, right? Where again, they want to play for these guys, and these guys have come up with some pretty creative strategies on both ends of the floor. Where like where like OKC has a pretty small team, but we've seen how they're able to kind of overcome that for most of the season. Obviously, playoffs are different, but still, that's something that you got to factor in. And I do wonder again where we go with the Hornets because we thought they'd be better this year, and they were pretty horrible. Obviously, injuries was a factor as well because LaMelo Ball barely played, but I still think there's a pathway for this team to maybe be a little bit better, especially if they, get somebody decent in the draft, right? Because you already have like a couple of guys that, seem like they're like Lamella Ball is already, I think, established as being pretty good. His issue is he just can't stay healthy. And I think that's been a problem because it's hurting his development as well, right? Where it's like you're just not getting enough reps on the court
Yeah.
to actually get better. Brandon Miller, right? We've already seen he had a terrific rookie season
Yeah.
and he should continue to get better. So you already have two guys that look like they have, pretty high potential. Brandon Miller, especially right as a wing scorer, right? I think that would add another element. After that, you got to find some defense. So we'll see if he can kind of also get them to play some defense as well, because that's really been the biggest issue for Charlotte, other than the injury issues is that their defense has been absolute garbage. I think to the trade deadline, it was pretty solid, but their offense was also garbage. But that was because there were so many guys out. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
But I think this should be a quality hire for Charlotte, because again, like I don't think they've had like a ton of elite coaches at all, right? I mean, like they had, I guess, Steve Clifford a couple of times. I guess James Borrego, right? And then I don't even remember who would have coached them during the Bobcats days. I think
Yeah.
think it was the late Paul Silas. I think was there for like a year or something
Okay.
like that. So I don't know, but either way, that's the tough part. It's hard to really evaluate because I don't know much about him, but it seems like because Charlotte's made a lot of changes, and it seems like they've made good changes. I think that this should be a quality hire. I guess also, in additional news, right? Nikola Jokic, right? He won MVP, right? Which I don't think was a surprise, right? It seemed like he was going to win it.
Yeah.
He was my pick, but obviously I would not have had a problem at all. If SGA had won it, because obviously, right, they have the 1 seed. He was great. But it's kind of interesting, right? Because honestly, I feel like the way that this went, I just feel like earlier in the season when Embiid was healthy, he was the favorite. He was gonna win it. Then he gets hurt, and I kind of feel like they just ended up just defaulting to Jokic. I mean, obviously he had a really good season, and to be honest, like 1 seed, 2 seed. I mean, they lost to the Spurs at the buzzer. They don't lose that game. They're the 1 seed. But yeah, like how do you feel about this pick? Because obviously we knew it was coming. And obviously there were some other finalists as well, right? You had SGA and Luca, but I don't know. Like if it wasn't Jokic, I would have said SGA. Like I don't know. Luca was really good, but I don't know. I mean, it's tough because I think for MVP, it just seems like the criteria changes every year. Because I think in general, it's kind of rough to have to tie, the award to team success because it's an individual award. But then at the same time, like you'll see certain years where it's like, oh, this team, had the best record and this was the best player, so we're giving them MVP. But then there's other years where it's like, oh, this guy didn't have, the best record, but look at what his team would probably be like if he wasn't out there, right? Like,
Sure.
like the argument for Jokic for a while was like, well, he's not playing with another all-star, all-NBA teammate, right? He's playing, it's not that it's 1 on 5, right? But it's like, his second best player isn't regarded in the same light as others, even though Murray's been really good in the playoffs, right? He's still not really looked at as being in the same tier as like, even like a Kyrie, for Dallas, or even like a Towns, right? Like, I mean, I don't know, I guess like Towns has been an all-star, multiple times. And, he was held in really high regard initially when he came into the league. But, I think that's generally been like kind of the argument for Jokic. But then obviously, even if you look at Shea, it's like, the other guys are great, but they weren't all stars or all NBA players. And then Luca, right? Obviously, they have Kyrie, and then it really drops off after those two. So I think those three make sense. Obviously, like I said, I think Embiid would have won it if he had played enough games, but he didn't. So and that's kind of what happens, with the new rules. But honestly, even if there wasn't that rule, he still missed a lot of games, right? He played what 39. So even if that rule didn't exist, he wouldn't have made it. He just would have been on All NBA.
Yeah. And the crazy part is like he's just continuing to add to the legacy. I have no problem with him winning this award. I think, at this point, you can really break it down and like you were talking about, it really all depends on your criteria. I was more on the Shea side of things just because I like the impact and what he does bring. But Jokic brings an insane impact as well. The guy averages a triple double pretty much. Just, I think 1 assist under or whatever. But the impact is always there and you can really, really see it. And I think Michael Malone had a very good quote back in April about it. He was like, it's hard to differentiate greatness from greatness from greatness. What is like the criteria? And I think like you're talking about, it changes. Like it's a really tough decision. The voting split was very interesting. I think Jokic had 79 first places. Shea had 15. Luka had 4. Giannis came in at 1. So that kind of shows you that there was a very steep victory
Yeah,
but between these three guys, which I think
pretty.
speak volumes.
Yeah, it was pretty definitive, I think, in that regard. Because, like you said, he won. The vast majority of the first place votes, right?
Yeah,
79, I guess, out of 100 or whatever, right? So,
yeah,
um, at the end of the day, we'll see. But like I said, it's kind of that was usually the argument for him, is that, his supporting cast, isn't quite the same, I guess, as others, people are saying, compared to some other, players that have had really good seasons, especially like there were some seasons where, like, I think in his first two MVP years, right, like Murray didn't even really play.
Right.
So, I mean, I guess no, he played for most of the first year and then got hurt at the end, but the second year he didn't play at all. So
Exactly.
that's where, that, and they were still a playoff team in both years. So that's where you factor that in. But I think it also kind of comes down to like the regular season numbers for all these players have just been way more insane in the last several years, where,
Yeah.
like 10, 15 years ago, you weren't seeing a bunch of guys averaging like 30, 10, and 12, or like 28, 7, and 6. Like you just didn't see that. Like people weren't putting up those crazy stats at all, just because, it was a slower pace. The offense wasn't quite as at the level as it was now, at least in
Yeah.
the regular season.
Sure.
Uh, so that's something that we're kind of seeing. But then it's also like at the same time, and obviously we'll get into Denver, if and when they get eliminated. But then it's like, okay. But then last year, though, a big part of what we talked about is like how all these guys play well together. But then now they're not playing well, and so now the argument is just, I guess, well, it's a one man show here, So I think that's kind of, an issue with the inconsistencies, but it also is a regular season award.
Yeah.
That's the other thing that you have to factor in. As well, like you said, like he's just adding to the legacy now. But I mean, really, for him, the biggest thing now is titles, because I mean, he already had two
100%.
MVPs, so he already has a lot of the individual accolades. Now he has to get more team success. And obviously he already has a title, but that's where he would obviously, like, there's not really much more he can do regular season wise that would elevate him.
Yeah.
Now it's all about the playoffs and titles.
Yeah.
We'll see if that works out this year. It doesn't really look like it, but you know, but again, like 3 MVPs is nothing to sneeze at all, because he's been consistently, one of the best players in the NBA the last, several years, and a lot of people have said he's the best player right now.
Yeah.
So and it seems like, like I said, if Embiid had won, then you would have looked at like 3 back-to-back MVP winners, where it's like Embiid, Jokic, Giannis, right? And that seems kind of right, because I feel like most people generally say those are like the 3 best players in the NBA for the most part. Maybe you swap one of them out with Luca, or
Hmm.
whatever, but that makes sense for the most part, right? Like I don't think like any of this is shocking, but obviously, again, I think SGA, like you said, if he had won it, like I wouldn't have complained at all. Like I
Yeah.
would have been like, yeah, he definitely earned it.
But like the thing I think with this one is like there's a huge case where you kind of look at the historical aspect of it from Jokic's point of view. And like I don't want to be that guy to pull up like the ESPN stats, but you kind of have to. He's like the only player alongside Chamberlain in NBA history to finish in the top 5 in total points, rebounds, and assists in multiple seasons. So that's one thing. He's also the second player to record 2,000 points, 900 rebounds, and 6,000 or 600 assists, not 6,000, in a season, joining Oscar Robinson. So there is like some sort of historical factor to this, where he had 25 triple doubles. He did a lot, this season, and I think the biggest one is he led the NBA with a plus 682 plus minus. So and when he was off the floor, Nuggets were minus 251 with their franchise player off the court. So I think, it kind of goes without saying if you really break down all these little stats. And I think that's kind of what the criteria was for this one, was these advanced stats and these ESPN-esque stats where you're kind of looking at it and breaking down every little minute detail. And it's like, okay, yeah, the guy clearly is like the clear-cut winner.
And then obviously, I think the next stuff, right, will be all NBA, right? Like they haven't done that yet. I think
Right,
that's the last remaining one, right? Because they've
right.
already done Detroit, they've already done Rookie of the Year, they've obviously MVP,
Most
six,
improved.
yeah, most improved. So that's all done. Now all
Yes.
we're basically waiting, and Coach of the Year. So now all we're
Yes.
waiting for is all NBA, right? All NBA first, second, third, all defense first and second, and then all rookie first and second.
Yes,
So
sir.
obviously we did our list of who we thought should have been on those teams. So if you want to see that, check out that episode. It was a little while ago. I think it was right before the playoffs
Yeah,
started.
we can link it.
So
I'll put it in the description.
yeah, link, I guess, will be in the description.
Yep.
So check that out. And then, again, we've talked about it. Obviously, like the draft lottery, right, will be coming up on Sunday, and obviously we'll be reacting to it, not live, right? But in that episode, we'll be talking about it as it goes. And, obviously, you look around and we know, which teams, have like I guess, have the edge, right, in terms of the top picks, right? Because we know for the most part, right, who were the worst teams in the league were, right? Like we know, teams like the Wizards, right? Teams like the Pistons, right? So I guess, yeah, exactly. There's your team right there. So I guess, we don't even really know at this point who the number one pick is going to be, right? Like
Right.
we know that there's a lot of players in the draft, right, that are kind of in similar-ish tiers, but and obviously, I guess I probably and obviously, we're not going to predict who's going to get the number one pick, but I
Right.
guess
That would be dumb.
yeah, but I guess of the top, of the lottery teams, right? So I guess we got Detroit, Washington, Charlotte,
Hmm.
Portland, Spurs, Raptors. I think theirs is protected to a certain degree where if it falls too low, it goes to who is it? Is it the Spurs or is it a different team?
I think it was the Spurs. I think wasn't that a part of the Pirtle thing?
Yeah, the Purple trade, I
Yeah.
think. Then Memphis, Utah, Houston, who doesn't have the pick, right? It goes to Brooklyn, right? Or
Yes.
OKC, OKC.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Then Atlanta, Chicago, Oklahoma City, Sacramento, Portland. I guess my question is, like, who would benefit the most, I guess, from having the number one pick, right? Like, because
Sure.
again, this is a weird draft where, some people say it's like just awful. Like, I think, like you and I have both said, there's still a lot of good players in the draft. There just may not be as many players that have superstar potential. But I guess, regardless, which team do you think would probably benefit from, having the number one pick? I mean, like obviously, like yeah, if you're like Sacramento or, one of those other teams that like just barely missed the playoffs, like yes, it would be awesome to have the number one pick. But like I said, who do you think ideally would benefit the most?
It's tough. It's a tough call because I feel like with this draft, like you kind of just talked about, there's no generational talent. There's no Wembenyama. There's no Paolo even. Like there's nobody that really like you can kind of I think start your franchise around, which is the really tough part. It's more like a plug and play kind of draft, which is odd, and those tend to be some of the more mediocre ones, but. They do still have some tremendous upside, I think, especially from a two-way perspective. I think there's a lot of good two-way players, and there's a lot of raw players as well. So it really depends on what you're looking for. And there's no clear-cut like guy, and there won't be until we know, the order of the draft. But to answer your question, I would probably say probably one of the like the worst teams. So it would probably either be the Wizards or the Spurs. If you want me to be honest, I would say the Spurs because you need pretty much the best guy available to help you build around Wemby, obviously. And I think with the Wizards, you just need something else because that roster is very bare bones as it is right now. And we already know that you're probably not going to build around Kyle Kuzma and Jordan Poole, so you do need to get some guys in this draft. I think that could potentially help bolster up your roster and maybe give you some cushion to move some other guys and figure out a way to really get this rebuild kind of kickstarted before the real drafts like start coming in where they're loaded with talent through positions 1 through 5. Because this one is like we just talked about. It's not like that. It's like mediocre. It's just there's no generational talent.
Yeah.
So I would go
Yeah,
like Wizards or Spurs.
yeah, I think the Spurs does make sense because also you factor in what if you maybe decided to trade it? Not that you would
Sure,
trade the number one pick, but like you could just factor in like, okay, maybe they, would be interested in bringing in some star now, and then
sure,
like I don't think they're gonna do it, but it just gives you a lot more flexibility because like you said, you can either take the best player available, or you could possibly trade it, or trade down or whatever is gonna happen. But yeah, I think yeah, and then with the Wizards, you just need some type of talent, like because I think with some of these other teams you could kind of say like we are like obviously you're not turning down a pick, but you could kind of say like we at least right now have somebody that we could probably build around. Like with Detroit, you could say we have Cade Cunningham.
sure.
I guess with obviously with the Spurs you have Wemby, but like you said, who do we have? Who do you have for the Wizards that you can say we can build our franchise around? Nobody,
Right,
obviously. Is
right.
it going to be in this draft? That's the tough question because there could be somebody that just pops off. Um, and ends up being like a terrific player. but we just don't know yet, and that's kind of the difficulty here. But yeah, I think that probably makes a lot of sense. I guess what would be the funniest outcome, before obviously we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think the funniest one would be like if you want me to be real, it would be something along the lines of Spurs get number one pick and they draft a guy like Sar. That would be funny because I think it would be kind of like a potential repeat in history of David Robinson and Victor Wem or David Robinson and Wembanyama, David Robinson and Tim Duncan.
Yeah,
Something along the lines of that. But it
right,
also would be funny if some of the worst teams kind of drop very, very far.
right.
And they go to like 4 or 5 or something
Yeah,
like
like
that.
if Toronto drops to 7, because I think I just checked where they're protected 1 through 6.
Right.
So then if it's 7, then obviously they don't get it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Like that
so
would
that
be a
would be
bad one.
yeah,
It'd
exactly.
be funny if Portland potentially got like the number one pick and everyone else kind of like follows suit. And it's like that would be funny in the sense of like people wouldn't be mad that Portland got the number one pick just because of the draft. And that's the crazy thing. Like it could all really change and depend on the number. There is no number one guy. Like it's all going to depend on what these teams need. So I think we can kind of start predicting who's going to fall where in the draft, depending on what this draft lottery order is going to be. Because,
Right.
if the Spurs get the number one pick, they're probably not going to pick Sar. They would probably pick a point guard or maybe like a wing. But if the Wizards got the number one pick, they're probably picking Sar because they don't have a center. So that's kind of the way that I feel about this entire draft.
You're not comfortable with Marvin Bagley and Rashawn Holmes?
I mean, I'm comfortable with them off at the 4 coming off the bench, like if they play left bench, but I'm not comfortable with them playing starting center. That's just simple as that. They're not very, and I don't want to turn it into a Wizards rant, but they're just simply not good. Bagley was
Okay,
good. I'll give Bagley
yeah.
that.
OKC gets the number 1 pick.
Oh, it's wraps. I mean, if they win, like if they win the title and then get the number one pick or something like that, we're done. But if they get the number one pick and they still like don't win the title, they're gonna be back again next year and better. So that's kind of scary. That would be funny too, though, because like that just kind of puts a stamp on the whole monopoly joke.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, again, and obviously there's a lot of situations that could change around. And we'll know on Sunday when that order comes around and we'll talk about it,
Yeah.
because I think it's going to be before the games, right?
Yes.
So I think it's before the first game. So we'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
But it's going to be interesting because, again, like there's a lot of teams, because like last year we talked about it at the same time, right? Like around the same time last year where we were like, yeah, if you're Wemby, where would you ideally want to go? And I think we mentioned, teams like the Spurs or whatever. And I think we also mentioned like where should he probably not want to go?
Yeah.
And we were like, I think we were like Detroit,
Yeah.
or something else
We
like
said
that. And
Detroit and Houston. I think were probably the two teams that we didn't, or it might have been Detroit and Charlotte that we were like, you
I
don't
think
want to go there.
It was Detroit and Charlotte. It
Yeah,
wasn't Houston.
yeah.
It was Detroit.
We were like, no shot. Like the Spurs is the best option for you. And what do you know? It happened.
Yeah. Yeah. Not
Which is
rigged at
crazy.
all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which is
Not
crazy. It makes no
yeah.
sense. Like I don't know how they actually got that pick. I really don't.
Well, that's why it's a lottery, I guess, where it's just kind of luck
But
based.
dude, it felt so scripted. Like there's
I,
no shot the
yeah.
Spurs get another generational talent in a big man.
Yeah. I mean, you know,
Hey,
there's
bro. It
There's
is what
other
it is.
scripts that it could have been. It could have been like, Jordan on his way out gets the number 1 pick, gets to
Oh my
take Wemby.
god, that would be so
Um,
funny.
yeah, but yeah, we'll see what happens. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts in the comments about the second round so far. Um, what you've liked, what you haven't liked, surprises. Obviously, let us know, your thoughts about the coach firings and hirings as well. Because again, if you leave a comment, we'll read it at the beginning of the video. Obviously, once those series in the second round are wrapped up, we'll be doing live streams, obviously talking about and reacting to it. So keep an eye on those and join us. Also, again, check out the socials. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We appreciate it. And we'll see you on Monday.